Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome you today here in this magnificent location. Thank you very much to the Czech presidency of the Council. To welcome you to the 2022 Schumpeter Innovation in Enterprise lecture. As you could see in this teaser video with references to the earlier lectures, this year it's the 7th lecture that we have. And it is a kind of homecoming for the Schumpeter lecture, because Joseph Schumpeter was born in 1883 in what was then the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, in the small city of Třešť in the Czech Republic. And there is another link to our current times, because his first professorship led him to Czernowitz in modern-day Ukraine. For the 2022 lecture, we decided to introduce an additional element into the program. Because since many years, we organize the Small and Mid-Caps Awards, together with the European issuers and the Federation of European Stock Exchanges. And as a token of this partnership, and before inviting Professor Luc Soete to the podium for his lecture, Peter Koblitz, President of the Federation of European Stock Exchanges and Chairman of the Prague Stock Exchange, will speak to us from the viewpoint of the world of enterprise. After Peter, we will hear from Professor Luc Soete about his take on resilience in the Schumpeterian sense. Professor Soete is a Belgian economist. He's a professor and the dean of the Brussels School of Governance. He's also a member of the advisory board of the University of Sussex Business School and the advisory board of the United Nations University Institute on Comparative Regional Integration Studies in Bruges, Belgium. He's a former Rector Magnificus and Professor of International Economic Relations at the School of Business and Economics of Maastricht University and a former Director of the United Nations University Merit, a joint research institute between the United Nations University and the Maastricht University. And among other economic functions, to keep this list a little bit shorter, he also serves on the board of supervisors of the Delft University of Technology, beside many other activities. Professor Soete has kindly agreed to take a few questions after his lecture, and this Q&A session will be moderated by my colleague Elisabeth Bachtemann, the SME Envoy for Sweden and Director General of the Swedish Agency for Economic and Regional Growth. I wish you all a very pleasant evening and a very inspiring speech, but first, Peter, the floor is yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me welcome you to the city which many of you like to come, like to return, and where we, born in Prague, really love. Actually, I'm looking at this hall and it looks like on the stock exchange, like 100 years ago. The round tables, people speaking to each other, trading, or probably not trading, at least exchanging ideas. Well, the stock exchanges are not looking that way anymore, as many of you know, but it's incredible how many people gathered here today. We gathered here during the Czech presidency, and just 2 weeks after 33rd anniversary of so-called Velvet Revolution, where we overthrew the communism in Czech Republic. Of course, first of this event, the Czech presidency, would not be possible without the second. As a direct participant of the events in November 1989 in Prague, I'm very proud where we stand now. We are part of free, democratic Europe, standing strong with our friends, fighting in Ukraine, and defending our shared values against totalitarianism, terror, and tyranny. I do see parallel between a free society, democracy, and liberal economy, and the development of the equity culture in the societies. Functioning capital markets are the places where the rule of law prevails, when there is accountability of those who are offering services to public, where we witness trust between the issuers and investors, and when one's decisions is responsibility of the people who take them. For me, it is no surprise that the best functioning capital markets are in the countries with stable democracies and the countries where rule of law is firmly embedded. I can assure you that our road to democracy was not easy, such as the road to the developed and functioning capital market is not easy either. We see many challenges which are similar to countries in CEE and to the countries in so-called developed Europe or original Western European countries. A major problem what we see is the missing investments or missing part where companies are raising capital from the equity, not from the debt. Over-reliance on the debt in Europe. The market capitalization of European markets is somewhere around 50% of European GDP, while in the United States, it's more than triple than this. We have to do something with that because that's blinding us to other sources of funding of finance, the growth of the companies, and including SMEs, of course. Now I could go on and talk about the fragmented and malfunctioning market structure, the lack of strong pan-European pension system, and so on and so on. But I will save that for another occasion. We have the SME Week in Prague. As we all know, SMEs are backbone of the European economy. They are vitally important in creating jobs, supporting growth, and boosting innovation. We need to help SMEs on their journey by facilitating easier access to capital, by for them to being able to invest in R&D, hire more staff, or expand their international presence abroad. For that, we need to nurture the local and developing financial ecosystems, which serve smaller companies and the investors and are enabling cross-border investments. Although in the EU we should focus on building united market, we see that SME markets are still predominantly very national. The SME markets can unite in Europe as well, but we have to work a lot on the uniting accounting systems, bankruptcy and solvency regulations, and a securities law. Until that, I believe they will still predominantly local. We have to make it easier for local companies to come to the capital markets because the US investment bank sitting in London, flying in the region, will not help SMEs. They are focusing on the big companies. As a committed European, I have no doubt that the positive effects of EU single market and the capital market union project. As a president of FESE, that's my different capacity, I have to assure you that all the European exchanges are doing whatever is possible to support our SME markets, to bring new listings and to facilitate the capital for those SMEs. I'm looking forward to today's evening lecture of Professor Soete, which I suspect will touch on several of these issues. And on that note, I would like to wish you an enjoyable evening and pleasant stay in Prague. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, what a fantastic place to be, and what an extraordinary moment I have here to be able to address you in this incredible scenery here. And after trying to perform as well as the previous organist who's gone, who's taking a rest, but I have to now perform here, and it's going to be a tough task. But what I would like to start with is really talking a little bit about, I'll try to give my lecture in terms of the main components of what we are talking about here. Schumpeter first, of course, and it was already referred to Schumpeter, born in Czechia. What better place than to have a Schumpeter lecture? And I told the minister already that maybe this is something you should get out of the Czech presidency, that is that the Schumpeter lectures are always given in Czechia in the future. Of course, Schumpeter wasn't just born here, but he also lived in extremely turbulent times. Remember the First World War, of course, the financial crisis. Schumpeter himself went bankrupt. He moved into private, in banking, he moved into politics, he became minister even. There was, of course, the Nazi regime, he fled, etc. So these were extremely turbulent times, and you could argue to some extent that we are witnessing the same turbulent times today. So from that perspective, I think the Schumpeterian legacy and the insights of Schumpeter are particularly relevant today in terms of giving us hints as to how we can address the current set of crises. Crisis, not just financial crisis, as back in 2008, but also the crisis of COVID, health crisis, the security crisis we're confronting today. So a whole set of cascading crises, polycrisis as it's been called. Crises who affect each other and hence reinforce the tremendous uncertainties and insecurities we are witnessing. Hence, what I will try to argue here is that Schumpeter's insights, and particularly his insights in the early Schumpeter, the Schumpeter of the entrepreneur, of the creative destruction of the entrepreneur, are particularly relevant today in the current environment. And what I've called here the schöpferischer Zerstörer, as he called it, the creative destructor as the entrepreneur. Let me first start a little bit with Schumpeter and innovation. Schumpeter is really the first scholar who made that distinction very clear between invention, which is to some extent an activity carried out by researchers in technical, scientific labs. You can think of basic research. You can also talk about much more applied research. It's what we today understand as research and development activities as they are being carried out in firms, in public sectors, in universities. It is leading to new ideas, often technical ideas, which is one part of the whole knowledge part. The second part, which Schumpeter really highlighted and brought to the forefront, was innovation. And this distinction between invention and innovation is really essential and has been made essential later on in lots of contributions by highlighting how innovations were really as if it were an economic lab. Trying to see if you were implementing these new ideas, these technologies, these new products, new processes, how would they work on the market? How would they work in particular applications which nobody could think of because they were new? And so innovation is really an economic lab, a tryout to see what works, what will lead to increases in profitability for the firm or the entrepreneur, or what will be adopted by consumers, by users, by other firms. And then he added this notion, what we call today, of diffusion. Schumpeter talked about the swarming of innovations, the building up of lots of innovations at one moment, which would have a major macroeconomic impact. Think back of all Schumpeter's contributions in terms of socialism, democracy, business cycles, etc., as he further worked on it in his later years. So the main point is, though, this contribution of Schumpeter is so important because we focus very much on these technical inventions, technical innovations, but we don't focus at all on all the other elements of innovation which Schumpeter brought to the fore, which are innovations without research, organizational innovations, social innovations. And I think this part of Schumpeter has become extremely relevant with the digital revolution, so to say, in which you find out tremendous opportunities for new organizational innovations, new ways of organizing production, organizing distribution, interacting with consumers, with other producers, etc. It's really the technological industrial revolution now in a digital form, which is starting again to operate and bring about all these changes and all these opportunities for innovation without carrying much research. So you could say we had a world in the 60s and the 70s when we looked very much at why do we have so much research, so many new ideas, but no innovation? Remember this, we call this the innovation paradox, very much flying over from the United Kingdom. Today we could say we have a lot of innovation, but with no research behind it. And yet we continue to focus on the research-innovation link versus the non-technical change. So research and innovation needs to be separated, and that is what I just explained, or tried to explain, how these two elements have always been associated with each other. In the European Commission, we have a DG, Research and Innovation, and yet these two elements are not necessarily linked anymore to each other. The last point I wanted to make is that whereas innovation is really this discovery process, this economic discovery process, innovation is also extremely entrepreneurial specific, individual specific. It will be the person, and this is where Schumpeter comes back in, the person with the ideals, with the beliefs, with the will to act, as Schumpeter put it, in terms of being really radical, in terms of implementing an idea which he had, or at least implementing the economics of that idea in terms of how we can bring it to the market. It's also very context specific. It will be very different in different situations, in different countries, in different regions. And it will be very time specific. It will again be very functional of the particular time. Hence the whole debate about technological revolutions, about spurts of growth linked to a sun swarming of innovation at some moments in time and not at others. It's important from that, why this is important, this context specificity, because it gives us a lead to why there is indeed a relationship between innovation and democracy. We can have the same technical inventions, but the application can become very different in different contexts. It could be that in some contexts, we are allowed to innovate in a much larger way, because the regulation enables that innovation on the market. But it could well be that in other countries, other regions, this is not allowed. Think, for instance, of the privacy, health, ethical issues, which would limit the way you can experiment economically to implement a new technology. Think, for instance, of artificial intelligence. It is, I think, in our European Union, it will be limited in the way we can use artificial intelligence in certain areas, in linking data sets to each other, to, for instance, privacy laws. That will not be the case in China. Even between the European Union and the US, there will be differences in the regulations surrounding, for instance, privacy, and hence limiting, enabling, on the other side, much more opportunities for innovation in artificial intelligence. It will also be time-specific. In some ways, the regulation will shift over time. For instance, think of autonomous driving. We would all live in a world, we still live in a world in which there is the freedom to drive a car. It could well be that in the coming decades, we will enter a world in which that freedom will be limited, and we will have less opportunities to drive freely a car. Just as before, if you go to the movies and you see the movies of the 70s and the 80s, you see everybody smoking. If you see movies today, you see nobody smoking. So there is continuously change in the way we appreciate particular features, whether they're health-related, whether they are security-related, whether they are ethical And hence, these changes lead you to different assessments of the way you provide the freedom to experiment, to come up with new innovations, either depending on the context or depending on the time. And this is a fundamental issue because it's clear that a country like China will be able to innovate much more with artificial intelligence than a democratic society like the US or than a community like Europe. This is what needs to be realized in the way we look at these distinctions between invention, innovation, and diffusion. It's all due to Schumpeter. Let me come to next point. Entrepreneurship. Schumpeter is, of course, most known because of the way he put this strong emphasis on entrepreneurship. For Schumpeter, entrepreneurship, he had his own ambitions. As you know, Schumpeter had lots of ambitions. Well known, I'm not going to cite them here, but you also know that he wanted to be, well, I leave that for discussions after the dinner to see all the ambitions Schumpeter has. But in any case, his personal ambitions were very much identified with what he perceived as being a missing element in economic theory. And this was the motivation of individuals in terms of creating something new, in terms of, as he put it, creating the dream and the will to found a private kingdom, the will to conquer and the joy of creation, rather than, as economic theory had it at that time, the homo economicus, characteristics by neoclassical theory, and basically a static agent who was just driven by purely prices and other economic incentives. Schumpeter brought in a much more personal assessment of the entrepreneur as a personal will to act, to solve problems, to create something new. And in that sense, sorry, I went in the wrong way. In that sense, you can see that Schumpeter's contribution on entrepreneurship and growth added an element which has been ignored. I think that my predecessors, from Philippe Aghion down to Jan Fagerberg, have all highlighted the importance of research, of innovation in terms of economic growth. What Schumpeter added was this individual entrepreneurship element, which has never really been included into economic theory. And this is really why I would say that, and of course, understandably, one has always focused on research, on technology, as the crucial element for economic growth, because without research, without such efforts, investments in research and development, in the long term, there would be no growth. But the point is, of course, that without the entrepreneur, whether he's in an existing firm or creates a new firm, there will be no applications of these new ideas. And hence, this entrepreneur does play a crucial role. You can, of course, say there must be more than just the mental situation of individuals wanting to become entrepreneur and to will to act to create something new. True. But in periods of crisis, you can start to argue that that is precisely what you need. And so my claim here is that implementing new ideas has always been, even in the interactions I had with the European Commission, you can clearly see the focus is always on the framework programs. It's always on new research activities. It's never on the entrepreneurship. And my claim would, of course, be that today, particularly in crisis situation, you need actually the entrepreneurial side. I put it here, if we want to model and why this is crucial, for instance, let me just pick up the issue about sustainability. If we want to model the transition to a more sustainable, more equitable, and more resilient economy, it's not new ideas. It's actually the implementing of existing ideas which becomes crucial. And that will be the line I will take from here on. So, what is it in terms of why, in particular in this moment of crisis, we desperately need this entrepreneur? Well, we need the entrepreneur in the Schumpeterian sense as the entrepreneur, the initiator of creative destruction. And to put it bluntly, as I put it here, is there today a shortage of new ideas, of knowledge on how to achieve sustainable development? Or is there rather a shortage of innovative entrepreneurs willing to take risks and who are prepared in periods of great uncertainty to challenge incumbents often locked into fossil fuel modes of production, playing for time to write off their capital? And this is to some extent the fundamental issue. We all are living here in a situation where we know that in terms of the next decades, we will enter in further sustainable crisis, and we are stuck with a production system which is basically locked in unsustainable development. It's shifting, it's trying the transition, but that transition is of course much more complex in a system in which you are producing whatever, motor cars with combustion engines of diesels, in which you are producing all activities which are based on high energy intensity, fossil fuel energy, etc., which of course raises issues about how and when you do the transition. The transition, hence, in other words, becomes a long-term initiative which raises lots of issues about timing and about the commitment you have to that transition. That is not the case of the creative destruction entrepreneur. The innovative entrepreneur doesn't have this backlog, this weight of the past behind him. So let me just quickly go, as time is progressing, on two features where you can really see how we are moving in this direction of giving more direction, responding to these challenges. The first is the missions. My colleagues here from the European Commission know how this notion of mission, Mariana Mazzucato, who gave one of the Schumpeter lectures here before, has been instrumental in developing this notion of missions into applications, etc. And as you all know, the European Union has introduced these 5 broad missions, etc., at the top level of the European Union to implement them into our societies. And so what is the message here is that we are no longer being neutral. Researchers cannot do research as they wish. No, we are giving direction. We're saying, we should like you to do research on how to replace plastics in oceans, how to solve the cancer, how to get climate neutral activities, how to get sustainable cities, etc. And of course, this is a major issue because it has a research dimension in which you take away the freedom, so to say, of research, and the freedom in which we believe that researchers must be free to do the research they want. And on the other hand, on the innovation side, you say, well, we would like you to go in certain directions of implementation. And of course, this is very difficult because we don't know what exactly is going to be the economic market in which we can introduce that innovation. So we basically are dealing with a framework which I would argue is extremely difficult to implement. It's really an issue whereby, and for me, the illustration is exactly that all the research on sustainable development, all the research over the last 10, 20 years has had very little impact, again, because we have not looked at the entrepreneurial side. We focused on the research side, and the research side has come up with lots of papers, lots of analysis, lots of new insights in terms of what could be possible relationships, lots of insights also on the methodologies, on possible non-linear impacts between various aspects of sustainability, but very little in terms of what do we do about it, the implementation part. Because the implementation part, again, apart from the public sector, of course, depends crucially on the entrepreneurial side, the guys who will implement it, the guys who are daring, who take risks, who are prepared to go for it, as opposed to the, what I would say, the incumbents' dominance. So, what I want to end up or go in the direction is that such top-down directionality, as was introduced by the European Union, requires basically bottom-up energy and initiative to be truly successful. These bottom-up initiatives really depend on the regional, local dimension. It is really at that level that you can really get local sustainable development going, and that you will see that the impact and the implementation is so much more facilitated. It is basically, and this is then the critique not just to DG RTD, as I put forward, but now the critique to DG Regio. It is no longer the smart specialization strategies which will suffice. Because these smart specialization strategies start or build on the past. They build on the dominant players within the region. And what we need is the challengers again. We need, at that regional level, we need a new internal, local initiative taking from lots of people. This is what I call place-based innovation as transformation tool. It is at this local level that this kind of entrepreneurial discovery process of innovation, as I tried to explain, which is so specific, context-specific and time-specific, as Schumpeter highlighted, has really its value. In this local context, this entrepreneurial process of finding out what would work or what would not work interacts with the regional players, with the local citizens, with stakeholders, with local finance possibilities. And this local arena, as I put it here, is where there is indeed the room for the Schumpeterian entrepreneur. The Schumpeterian entrepreneur of the creative destruction type, because he can then, in interaction with his local community, local partnerships, can interact and can activate to some extent his desire, his motivation to come up with something new, with new ideas, with new concepts. And it's in this diversity of Europe that we finally find the applications and the implementations of all these local applications of missions, local responses to the various crises regions are confronted with in very different ways. I'm talking here both about the sustainability as well as about the security crisis. And it offers, of course, a tremendous room for experimentation. It offers room for experimentation, for innovation in policy making in terms of bottom-up, responding to the European Green Deal at the top, having this kind of way in which, from the bottom up, we can try to get the European Green Deal underway in terms of this notion. It's what I've called the square. I don't know if many of you have seen the square. The movie The Square. I was very frightened when I entered this particular place, that some people might get very frightened if I started about the square. But I'm not talking about that part of the movie, the square. I'm talking about the square in terms of the place in which one can have trust, believes in each other, trust each other, trust the citizens, trust the stakeholders, etc. And that notion of the square, which we are publishing in a forthcoming publication organized by the GRC, the Joint Research Center in Sevilla, is really the issue where you could say, in this square, you see all the confrontations between climate change, constraints in terms of biodiversity, clean energy versus fossil fuel availabilities. All these other features play in this local environment, and it is in that local environment that you can then try to develop, activate, so to say, this Schumpeterian innovative entrepreneurs and this creative destruction process. And there, of course, the focus shifts now from the local incumbents in this region towards the SMEs. The SMEs who are there and either deliver to these local incumbents, dominant incumbents, but also who have a lot of opportunities to respond to some of the challenges of the crisis today. And this is where really the square, and I refer to the publication itself, offers opportunities for all kind of sandbox regulations, as we call it, flexibility in regulations depending on the particular situation of that region or that locality versus another. To conclude, Schumpeter's emphasis on this exceptional, and I quote here from his own writing, the exceptional, supernormal nature of individuals with exceptional intelligence and energy was not particularly popular amongst innovation scholars. And I think most innovation scholars will not pay much attention to that particular element of this kind of very personalized impression of what the entrepreneur was and should be. And indeed, most studies, most research has shown that innovation is very much based on research and development, on technical numbers of scientists and engineers, on the research efforts countries are prepared, firms are prepared to deliver. Entrepreneurship has often been ignored in there. The question is today whether the current poly-crisis situation with its tremendous need for resilience in society, does not underscore Schumpeter's analysis. And I conclude with this quote, to put it bluntly, we do not need political activists gluing themselves to old paintings. We need Schumpeterian entrepreneurs gluing themselves to new ideas. Thank you. Elizabeth, thanks.
So thank you so much for that very thoughtful and to some extent provoking lecture, Mr. Soete, Professor Soete. Very stimulating indeed. I will invite you to ask some questions, but I will take the opportunity, since Sam has this assignment, to maybe ask the first questions myself. I thought it was really interesting, the last part, especially the last part of your lecture. And I would like to ask you, what do you think is lacking or needed in order to make this shift from this more top-down perspective on innovation or implementation of innovations to a more bottom-up, place-based perspective of innovation? What could be incentives or drivers to foster such a shift? And me, myself, coming from being a policymaker, or to some extent still am, do you have any messages to policymakers? Any do's or don'ts?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not a policymaker. This is the nice thing about being on the sitting, watching it all. But I think that policy has been too much focused on existing players, whether they are firms, private sector, whether there's the public sector. And I think we need really to create a kind of revolution. But the revolution at the level of entrepreneurs. And how do you get a revolution going is a difficult issue. I don't think there are that much economic measures you can take, incentives. It's not going to work so much with incentives. But you must certainly, I would say, at the level of education, in universities, in higher education establishment, bringing in entrepreneurship as something which is natural in the course and in the framework, daring to take risks, creating spheres in which one is prepared to go for it, I think are elements which probably could help. I still think that this is really the biggest difficulty Schumpeter had also. Schumpeter was, I think, probably emphasizing so much this creative destruction of entrepreneurs because of his own successes and failures. And I think this is really where we should look today at and look carefully how we have all these areas where we know that things are not working, where we know that policy is not working. I think there we need an entrepreneurial revolution.
Okay, do we have any revolutionists out here? Do we have any questions? There are microphones out here in the hall, so please feel free to take the opportunity to ask a question or maybe make a short reflection of what you have heard. Please, gentleman over there.
Thank you, Tim Krögel from the German Confederation of Skilled Crafts and Small Businesses. You talked about the poly crisis that we're living in. What we are finding is that as the crises are progressing one after the other, the frame set by policy is getting tighter and tighter. And the room for entrepreneurship and for let's say, your own kingdom, as you called it, is really tightening up. And this is something which I think is a bit of a paradox in what's going on. Mm-hmm. We need the innovation, but on the other hand, what's happening actually is that policy is taking over more and more of our life. We can also say for financing, government is financing more and more things these days. All this is going in the direction where we're actually tightening the space that we currently, or that we used to have as entrepreneurs. how do you see, how can we reverse this? How can we go back to sort of opening up again the space and moving a bit away from all the policy regulation? For example, if you take sustainability reporting is one big issue for entrepreneurs, because it's basically, as you said, linking to existing value chains, but the entrepreneurs, they're not living in existing value chains. Yes, they have to apply all this when they want to enter a market. So it's a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of burden that's coming our way, which is ever tightening up even more this space around us. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I fully agree with the increased, say, narrowing down of opportunities in terms with the administrative control growing with each crisis. That's absolutely true. But I still believe that, you know, if you really are convinced of a particular issue and that you can contribute to that, etc., I still think we need to do something about various elements. My colleague Mark Sanders at Maastricht University, who has very much this, I follow his line of thinking here, put forward a number of very radical transformations we might need and which are totally counterintuitive. For instance, the first thing is a very strong critique on intellectual property. And the reason is, of course, that you can see that the current systems of intellectual property are primarily used by incumbents. They're basically there as an institution which is set up, which protects the research and development activities within the large firms and makes sure that at least, if you think, for instance, in artificial intelligence, or you think even in the nuclear industry, all the aspects of the modern, the small modular nuclear energy attempts as they could exist, you see that they're totally protected by a whole range of patents, etc., in this particular area. So there are many areas where, as an individual entrepreneur, you will not be able to break through. You're stuck. You're basically limited. You're not allowed to come up with new ideas you might have because they're already protected. These new ideas are all already intellectually protected. So if you could reflect that we completely shift the system and we make it completely open, think over it, think further what it would imply, etc. And I think that in moments of resilience, this is the sort of radical perspectives we should think of. The same, for instance, with respect to the way in which talented people, once they leave their higher education, immediately are being bought up by the existing large companies. Again, and in the current labor market shortage, at least talent shortage in many of our countries, you can see that a new entrepreneur is in an impossible position because he cannot attract the talented people. They also have then to take the risks which he was prepared to take. So again there, if we think of issues such as basic income, from a perspective of enabling dynamism in the pool of talented people, because everybody has a basic income, and hence it might well be easier, much easier, to attract talented people to come into new companies rather than all of them going to the large established firms which have the money to pay high salaries, etc. So you could think you have to really start to reflect on every point and see to what extent the challenging element in these different policies, etc., should not become one which might question existing institutional setups we have with respect to both research and with respect to innovation and diffusion, such as labor markets in this particular case. Again, these are lots of examples, and these were examples which Mark Sanders in his paper and his inaugural lecture highlighted.
Okay, thank you. I think we have one more question here, the lady in red.
Thank you very much. Also, did you used to play in a punk band when you talk about revolution? No, it was a German joke, sorry.
Yes.
No, usually when people go on stage and talk about revolution, they usually have a musical career just before. Sorry, so I actually disagree about policy. Also like, hi, my name is Lisa Lang. I'm a director of EU Policy and Affairs with EIT Climate Kick. So I'm supposed to like policy, which I actually do. So my statement is here like that if we choose to see policy not as a hindering point for entrepreneurs, but actually as an opportunity to create a level playing field and as a framework to speed up and revolutionize and unite us for like the biggest challenge what we have, and that is climate change. And we can only fight climate change by full inclusion and full diversity. And that just means an absolute revolution. So in the mindset of revolution, how can we create a diverse room and also get like the non-policy makers involved and excited again in policy making?
Maybe I should ask this to Peter, because the financial markets are, of course, one of the big players in terms of enabling this diversity to emerge. And the extent to which, you refer to the debt ratio versus the US, the issue to which, indeed in Europe, we lack this kind of dynamism on the capital markets to enable these radical entrepreneurs to come up and to be covered by, I mean, it remains an issue that the whole focus in Europe seems still to be, and as a policymaker, I will push it back to you, of to have recovery, resilience funds and others. And I think in Europe at the moment, the amount of public monies available are infinite. I mean, we talk about how much, I don't know, 3 billion in total. It's practically impossible to come up with a new idea somewhere where there isn't some or the other line of a subsidy, whether it is a subsidy from the RFF funds, a subsidy from whatever, Horizon Europe, it's regional funds, etc. So the funding is totally dominated at the moment by policy. And we need the private funds back in the picture, because these will know exactly how, indeed, we will get these dynamic entrepreneurs, these innovative entrepreneurs coming up. So I would say there are lots of elements. I raised the labor market as another one, the flexibility in that labor market, but also the issue that a basic income might actually be a solution in terms of providing at least a minimum income so that entrepreneurs in all kinds of areas could do it just because they believe in it and they know that they have a sufficient income to live off it. So this kind of dynamism is what I would believe could help, but I don't think, with respect to policy making, it will help you a lot.
Okay, do we have yet another question? There is no... Yeah, over there.
Hi, and thank you so very much for mentioning funding. So one of those tiny SME entrepreneur, when we are dying, literally dying right now, there is no more money into the system. I'm just thinking, where is the microfinance? Where are the policies on tiny little microfinances to help entrepreneurs who cannot perhaps spend 6 months to a year chasing after policy money? Yes, there is. I don't deny it. But the whole amount of time taken to go after that funding is just too much for SMEs. Yep. We don't have that kind of manpower to chase after that. So those microfinances, those tiny fundings that we can access to, I don't see them happening. The banks charge sometimes 18% on an overdraft just because some of the clients are paying late. So all of those things would really help SMEs. I would hope and wish people who are sitting here and policymakers pay attention to those tiny little things for SMEs. We are not very big. We just need little, tiny over month-to-month end. So that's just a little call from an entrepreneur. Thank you.
Yes. There's nothing I can add to what you said. I think this is part of this distinction between large and small, which I'm sure you will be discussing over the next 2 days here in the SME Assembly. And we're also at the side of funding. The system is in favor of the existing large firms. That's the system. That's the way capitalization works. And that's what Schumpeter brought to the fore with his continuous emphasis on this role of creative destruction, of innovative entrepreneurship.
So I think that was the last question for this evening in this format, but we can continue to discuss with each other, and Professor Soete will join us for the dinner. So thank you once more for a very thought-provoking lecture, and I'm very happy for your sharing your thoughts and your knowledge. And it's, as I understand it, a question about changing the perspective, and also maybe being more careful about the frameworks that we have for entrepreneurs and for entrepreneurship in Europe and in our various countries, and also not losing sight of the really small companies and the really small entrepreneurs. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Again.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
And please enjoy your dinner. See you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I will be really short. Just a few words on behalf of the Czech presidency, and then the dinner will be served. But let me just say that I'm very happy that you all came to Prague for this wonderful event. I'm very thankful to the professor. He was telling us about the Schumpeter, and that the Schumpeter is home. And I thank the professor even for the lecture about the history of the Schumpeter. But the thing is here that at that era of Austro-Hungarian, we have two famous innovators. One is Schumpeter, described by the professor, and the other, who is very well known, worldwide known, the other one, known only by Czechs, is his colleague, Mr. Zimmermann. And the Zimmermann was also born in Czech, and then he was raised in the Austro-Hungarian style. And I would just say a few words to honor him, because we Czechs are nationalism, and the Zimmermann was more nationalist. So we was very happy actually that from this municipal house balcony, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk announced the first Czechoslovakia, first republic in 1919 and 18. I think that was really a good era for the innovations in the Czech Republic, because the mass production was established through the whole world, and actually Czech had become most industrial country in the world, not even in Europe, but we were really leading. Then sadly the Communist Party came, and we were under the communists, but this was also a very interesting era from the point of view of innovations. Our auto mechanics were the biggest innovators because they needed to repair the German or foreign cars without the spare parts. And they did it with their creativity and innovations. And that's why maybe 20 years after the Velvet Revolution, here in Czech we have very beautiful technological startups, not only based on contact lenses, but also in the software industry like Avast, and we have some medicines which are now really booming and strong. For example, the Parkinson treatment. Some of those things we will show you tomorrow at the exhibition, those Czech finest. So in a way, I would like to invite you for tomorrow's conference and see for your eyes what we Czechs can offer to the world. If I may then look in the future, I see the potential in circular economy, which is again what we could learn from the communist era, because we didn't have spare parts, so we need to make them by our own hands. The circular economy is going back to the resources, reusing the stuff, making circular, making it recycle. And I think we Czechs will be great in it, and it's a great opportunity for us as a nationalism led by the Zimmermann. Bon appetit.